Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to take another look at the TrimUI Smart. This is a device that came out last year, and I had kind of mixed feelings about it. And it had a lot of good things going for it, including this smaller, more pocketable design, and it also has some pretty excellent controls. However, it did feel like the software wasn't fully formed, and that just took away from the whole experience. Well, in this video, we're going to take a look at a custom firmware that kind of fixes all of those software issues that I had previously. And so now we're at a point where this device is really coming into its own. Not only do we have that nice mix of hardware and software, but the price has also been reduced by about 20 bucks. And I think the TrimUI Smart has a big advantage over all the other decent budget handhelds on the market today. And that is, it's a horizontal handheld, which means for me at least, it's going to be a lot more naturally comfortable. So in this video, we're going to take a brand new look at the TrimUI Smart and see if it's going to be worth that $50 to $60 price point for you. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and jump right in. Okay, as a quick summary from my review, here is a look at the specs. And there's a few notes here. Number one, this is not the most powerful device in the world. It can essentially play up to PlayStation 1 with relatively little issue. The display on this is also relatively small. It's 2.4 inches with a 4:3 aspect ratio. This makes it very close in size to the original Game Boy Color screen. Another standout feature is that this is the first small handheld that has both Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get further in. Now, in terms of pricing, this was originally listed for $80, which I think was a little bit high. But thankfully, now that it's older, you can find it for a lot cheaper. For example, the average price on AliExpress is about $60 or less. And as of making this video, there's a listing on Amazon for 53 bucks with Prime shipping. So we're going to consider this to be a $50 to $60 handheld right now. Now here's a quick summary of what I liked and what I didn't like about the TrimUI Smart in my review. And a lot of this had to do with the fact that I liked most of the physical components, but the software had some issues. So let's do a quick revisit over some of these properties. We're going to start with the hardware. I think the number one thing it has going for it is its overall size and look. This to me very much feels like a late 90s or early 2000s style handheld. And there are some things I could nitpick. For example, the screen to body ratio is pretty bad, but I also think that's one of its strengths because even though it is very small, it has a lot of space to put my hands, and so it doesn't feel cramped. So I do think it's a good balance between being small, pocketable, and comfortable. The controls themselves are also excellent. The D-pad and the face buttons have a soft, clicky kind of feel to them. It's very similar to what you would expect with something like a PlayStation Vita. And because the travel is very low, they don't have to make the buttons so prominent. And that also is going to contribute to its pocketability because it doesn't stick out that much. I also like the fact that it's very rounded. It's almost puffy feeling. And as a result, it's very comfortable to hold in the hand. Now, there are some physical drawbacks that are still there. For example, the buttons themselves rattle a little bit. And these menu buttons on the bottom are still a little bit louder and clickier than I would like. But all around, as far as small devices go, I think this is a really great size. You can see that it is quite a bit smaller than something like the MinUI Mini Plus, but also bear in mind that the major concession here is going to be that smaller screen. The way I see it, if you're looking for something that's similar to the MinUI Mini in terms of pocketability, but with a horizontal form factor, this is probably your best bet right now. And finally, the other bonus is that this one feels extremely sturdy compared to other options. The build quality itself feels very sturdy in the sense that I don't mind just throwing it in my pocket even without a screen protector. And so in that regard, I think this is an excellent casual handheld that you can take around with you when you're out and about. And I also think it could stand up to the rigors of a child using it because it's that sturdy. Next, we're going to talk about the software. If you remember my original review, I said that the stock firmware was not terrible, but the emulators did feel unpolished, and there were some qualities to it that were pretty annoying. For example, it had this loud background music you couldn't turn off, and then also it had this really bright LED light. But one of the things I did like about it is that the firmware itself was relatively straightforward. It's pretty easy to navigate, find your game, and start it right up. And managing the ROM files within the SD card was pretty simple too. However, in this video, we're going to focus on a custom firmware called MinUI. And this firmware is super simple and intuitive to use. In fact, the first version of this firmware was originally built for a TrimUI device called the Model S. And so it feels right at home here with the TrimUI Smart. At its most basic level, it's very simple. You would pick your system, then your game, and then rock it from there. However, I'm going to spend a few minutes just kind of talking through the firmware and the experience that you can expect. Number one, the way that you change the volume and brightness is by pressing either the select button or the start button and then the two shoulder buttons. The volume will be controlled by pressing the select button and then the brightness with start. And this is super handy because the device itself does not have dedicated volume buttons. Also, we've got a nice range when it comes to brightness. The max setting is pretty bright, but then also it can get pretty dim at the lowest setting too. Now previously I said this was a device that you wouldn't want to play in the dark, but it didn't have anything to do with the brightness. It had to do with that LED light that I mentioned before. This thing was super bright, and unfortunately in the stock firmware there was no way to turn it off. And thankfully within the MinUI firmware they have turned this off, so you don't have to worry about it. In fact, right now the only time you'll see the LED light is when you first boot it up for a moment, and then also when you put it into sleep mode. Now other than that, the interface itself is very simple. There are no settings or menu options. Instead, you'll just navigate to your game, press the A button, and start it right up. And if you're looking for a more plug-and-play experience, that's really going to be about it. The emulators themselves have already been optimized to run at their very best for this particular model. However, while in a game, if you press the menu button, it'll bring up the other main feature of MinUI. And that is we have a universal settings interface. Within here, we can quickly save a save state as well as load it right back up. And then also we can enter into the options menu. And depending on the console that you start up, some of these settings will be unique. Now the front end one is going to be mostly universal. This will allow you to do things like adjust the aspect ratio, and you can also adjust the CPU performance between overclocking and underclocking. And if you have any questions as you go through this, there's a label on the bottom that'll explain every setting as you go. Now these emulator settings are going to be unique depending on the console that you're running. So for example, here with Game Boy, you can see I have all sorts of colorization options. And again, all these settings are going to be explained. If you press the A button, you can actually see the explanations in full screen. Either way, yes, depending on the emulator, you'll have some fine-tuned tweaks that you can do if you'd like. Additionally, all of the emulator controls are 100% mappable. So if you do want to adjust something in a particular way, you can absolutely do that right here. In addition, there's an options menu called shortcuts. These are the hotkeys you can set up for things like saving or loading a state or turning on fast forward. And finally, at the bottom, we can also save our settings. Once you have everything set the way you'd like, you can set it for all Game Boy games at once, or you can set up settings particular to any specific game. Now there's a couple other really handy features within MinUI that aren't quite intuitive within the settings, so let me show you those real quick. Anytime you're playing a game, if you press the menu button once, it'll bring up the options, but if you press it again, it'll put it to sleep. And anytime you put the device to sleep while a game is running, it'll actually do a quick autosave. That means if you'd like, you can now turn off the device, and the next time you turn it on, it's going to go right back to where you were before you put it into sleep. So essentially this works a lot like a suspend function. On other devices running MinUI, you can just hold onto the power button and it'll do the same thing, but because the TrimUI power button is a power toggle, they had to do something a little bit more unique. Another thing that's really handy is the auto load function. So say we're playing a game and we create a save state, and then after that we turn off the game. Now the next time we navigate to that same title, instead of pressing the A button to start it up, we can press the X button. And the X button is going to start the game, but then also auto load that last save state that you made. So if you're within a menu and you want to quickly go right back to where you were, this is what I would recommend doing. Now, even though the main strength of MinUI is its simplicity, there are some things that you can do that are a little more complicated. For example, you can manually create your own collections. And the instructions to set this up are actually within the README file when you first download the firmware, but essentially all you do is make a text file and then list out the path of all the games that you want to have within that specific collection. So for example, here I have two collections. The first one is called Favorites, and I just threw a bunch of games in here. But of course, the collections could be anything you wanted. So for the next example, I made one called the Metroid series. And within here, I put all the Metroid games that run on this device in the playthrough order. So really, the sky's the limit when it comes to these collections. You want to throw all your Pokemon games in one, or if you want to have a collection dedicated to specific genres, you could do that as well. Another handy feature of MinUI is that there are optional packs or apps that you can add. For example, this one here is called Clock, and it'll allow me to set the game time at any moment I want. So if you're playing something like a Pokemon game and you want to set the clock a couple hours ahead, you can do that here. And finally, probably the most exciting feature that I've found so far is that MinUI is now cross-compatible with a bunch of other retro handhelds. So for example, here I'm taking my TrimUI Smart card and putting it in the MinUI Mini. And not only is the software and the ROMs there, but also all of my save games. So if you want to resume a game you were playing on the MinUI Mini or vice versa, you can do that here. And in addition to the MinUI Mini, there are a couple other devices that now work with it, including the MinUI Mini Plus and the Anbernic RG35XX. So if you own one of these devices or even multiples, you'll be able to swap the SD card between them and still retain all your games and your save files. Now, I don't want to give the impression that MinUI is absolutely perfect because there are some things that I think could still use a little bit of work. For example, one of my favorite things about the TrimUI Smart is that it has both Wi-Fi and Bluetooth functionality. Now, unfortunately on the stock firmware, it was kind of broke. I had a really hard time getting it set up. But at the very least, I could see the potential of using this device with Bluetooth headphones as well as Wi-Fi connectivity. Now, unfortunately, MinUI does not currently support Wi-Fi or Bluetooth. However, like I mentioned, MinUI is scalable, so if somebody wanted to make an app that made use of Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, it is definitely possible. So I do have hope that we will see those functionalities sometime in the future. Another thing to bear in mind is we're working with a 240p resolution display. That means games like Mega Man X on the Super Nintendo will not scale perfectly. You can see with the life bar, it's just not quite balanced. However, I did find that with a 2.4-inch display like this, it doesn't really bother me that much. You'd have to get really close to the screen to even see that difference. So for my part, even though I am pretty particular about having balanced pixels, it didn't really bother me on this 2.4-inch display. And for those systems that are going to scale properly like Sony PlayStation, everything looks nice and crisp. But of course, bear in mind, because we have a smaller screen, the text itself might be a little bit smaller in some of those later consoles. For example, playing a text-heavy PlayStation game may not be the best way to go. Additionally, the out-of-box performance may not be able to hit every single game. For example, Tekken 3, one of the hardest games to play on PlayStation overall, does get a little bit of audio crackling here and there. But thankfully, the emulators do have a bunch of mitigations in place. So if you do run into problems with a game, the easiest solution is to press that menu button, go into Options and Front End, and then adjust the CPU speed to the performance mode to overclock that CPU. For most games, including those hard-to-run Super Nintendo games, this is going to resolve your issue right then and there. However, if you're still having problems after that, there are other options you can use. And this is going to vary by emulator, but some of those will be things like audio sync, as well as a light frame skip. Either way, the way I see it, everything up through PlayStation 1 is definitely going to be playable. And for the vast majority of PlayStation games, you won't have to do any sort of settings tweaks whatsoever. And if you do happen to run into any performance issues, it's relatively easy to fix them within those universal options. But of course, if you ask me, I think that this device mostly excels in those more lightweight systems anyway, and these are all going to play just fine. In particular, those handheld systems like Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance are just a joy to play on this little device. And I love the fact that we have all the little emulator tweaks that I love to play around with. For example, there's a color correction fix within the Game Boy Advance settings in case you want to have it look a lot more like the original Game Boy Advance screen. And for other systems, you can do things like removing sprite limits or cutting off a couple pixels here and there to make sure everything looks more balanced. And for me, this is kind of the beauty of MinUI. When you first start it up, it's going to work just fine. But if you do also want to get into the settings, they are there available for you as well. And so from a performance standpoint, yes, it can play up to PlayStation 1, and yes, there will be a couple games where you have to tweak the settings, but the real sweet spot of the TrimUI Smart is the fact that everything up through the 16-bit systems are going to play just fine. Anyway, that's about it for this video. I saw there was a new update to MinUI, so I decided to try it with this device, and I was just blown away at how good the experience was now. I love the fact that a year ago when I reviewed this device, I said it had a lot of potential. And here we are just 1 year later where the potential has now been realized. Not only is this device now a joy to play from a software perspective, but they've also dropped down the price about $20. And so we're kind of in a best case scenario. Those early adopters now have really mature software, and everyone else who had a little bit of interest in this device but wanted to wait to see how it all fell out will now save about $20. Now, of course, bear in mind this device is a little bit niche in the fact that it's very small, and so I wouldn't really consider this to be a perfect or one-and-done handheld. After all, that 2.4-inch screen can get a little bit squinty. However, I do think it excels in what it's meant to be, and that is a super portable device that's easy to pick up and play and just works. So here's the way I see it. If you prefer a more vertical orientation, something that reminds you of the original Game Boy or Game Boy Color, then I still think in the budget space, the MiU Mini Plus and the Anbernic RG35XX are the way to go. These devices also cost about $60 each and have custom firmware that simplifies the entire user experience. However, if you're like me and you prefer a horizontal form factor over vertical, then I do think the TrimUI Smart is worth your consideration. It has all the pocketability factors that I loved about the original MiU Mini, but it's a lot more comfortable and sturdy. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Do you have a TrimUI Smart, and have you tried MinUI on it, and how is that experience for you? Or is there something about this device that doesn't quite fit your needs? For me, I've finally fallen in love with the TrimUI Smart 1 year later. However, I'm not quite ready to say this is the best small device ever just because that screen is just a little bit too small for my tastes. I think if it was a 3-inch screen and maybe a 480p display, it would have been perfect. However, on its own, it's still a great time. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.